As I'm sure that many of you well know by now, the much acclaimed Kherson Counteroffensive is currently underway. A few days ago, I made a video discussing why I believed at the time that the counteroffensive wouldn't happen despite being talked up to no end in the mainstream media, but it seems that I was wrong and that Ukraine has indeed chosen to go along with this counteroffensive. The first big Ukrainian attack in the Kherson-Mykolaiv area took place on August 29th. That means that today, September 3rd, is day 6 of the ongoing Ukrainian operation in the Kherson-Mykolaiv area. And so far, what these past 6 days of intense battles in the Kherson-Mykolaiv area show us is that the Russians appear to have the upper hand. Specifically, the Russians have superiority in drones, in unmanned aircraft, and also superiority to a much greater extent, I might add, in artillery and air power. Given that the battlefield in question consists of open terrain, of wide open steppes, this makes conducting an offensive for Ukraine almost impossible. Up until now, all attempts that have been made by the Ukrainians in order to break through the Russian defenses have essentially ended in failure, with a very high number of casualties for the Ukrainian armed forces. And this can be evidenced by multiple things, one of which is the fact that we are hearing reports of dozens of ambulances traveling in what are essentially convoys, traveling to and from the front lines, evacuating wounded soldiers by the hundreds presumably, transporting them to various cities near Kherson and near Mykolaiv, to various hospitals, many of which are reported to be over capacity. We also have a number of reports which have been officially confirmed of a day of mourning being announced in the Transcarpathia region of Ukraine. The 128th Mountain Assault Brigade originates from this region, and supposedly many of the soldiers of this brigade have died during the various attacks on Russian formations in the Kherson-Mykolaiv area. And of course, another piece of evidence which strongly suggests that this Ukrainian offensive is not going to plan is the fact that it's basically not being reported on at all by either the Ukrainian side, by either Ukrainian mass media or Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reports, and likewise, it's not being reported by the media in the collective West. And we've even heard reports of a gag order being issued by the Ukrainian government, which prohibits war correspondents on the Ukrainian side from reporting on the course of this offensive or giving their own views or opinions as to how it is currently going. So with that said, I think that we should note that almost all information that we have on the course of this offensive comes from the Russian side. Now, the Russian side has reported specific figures as to the number of destroyed vehicles, the number of killed and wounded personnel on the Ukrainian side, and these numbers are very high. Going off of the statistics that were reported by various Russian sources, Russian war journalists and reporters from August 29th to September 1st, and specifically I am referring to the numbers that were reported by Russian military expert Yuri Podolaka and also by the team of journalists referred to as Rybar. These sources suggest that the number of killed in action Ukrainian servicemen over the first 4 days of the counteroffensive are somewhere around 2,000, and the number of wounded soldiers are somewhere around 6,000. And given these numbers, we've heard many reporters, many analysts compare the current Ukrainian losses to those suffered at the Battle of Ilovaisk, which happened way back in 2014, which was for a long time the single largest battle that the Ukrainian armed forces had lost. And when I say that the current losses are being compared with the losses that the Ukrainian armed forces suffered at Ilovaisk, it should be noted that the current losses are actually much higher. Now, assuming that this is even partly true, another reason to believe that the Ukrainian offensive is not going as planned is that in exchange for these very high losses, the Ukrainians have, up until so far September 3rd, achieved essentially no territorial gains. What all of these attacks, which take place every day across multiple parts of the front line in the Kherson-Nikolaev region, all seem to lead to is that the Ukrainians are either outright halted by Russian ground forces and then ground up by artillery and airstrikes, or in some cases, in a number of cases, manage to advance 5-10 kilometers through the first line of the Russian defense and end up in what the Russians refer to as firebags, where the Ukrainian forces are essentially surrounded by the Russians on three sides, including by Russian artillery, which then closes off any escape routes and slowly grinds them down with artillery and airstrikes. After this, the Russians often counterattack and push back the Ukrainian forces to their previous positions. I should stress that this is what has been happening so far. That is by no means a guarantee that the same things will continue to happen again and again for the foreseeable future, although given everything that we are hearing from the front lines, given the Russians' overwhelming superiority in artillery and in air power, future Ukrainian attacks in this area are likely going to be met with the same kind of failure. However, multiple sources on the Russian side, various experts, analysts, have suggested that the entire offensive in Kherson and Nikolaev may either only be one of the offensives that Ukraine is going to conduct in the near future, or alternatively, that it is not even the main offensive, but rather simply a distracting maneuver. And what many of these experts and analysts suggest is that the main Ukrainian strike is going to come soon, and that it is going to come in the Kharkov region, and most likely specifically near the town of Izium. Now, I don't know whether or not this is true one way or another. I am simply reporting here what I've seen many other analysts and experts, many of whom are much more qualified than myself, report. And given the specific timing of these various attacks and offensives, many analysts have also come to the conclusion that they are going to likely persist despite their ongoing failure, at least until September 8th, when another meeting of the Ramstein Group is scheduled. The Ramstein Group being a collection of defense ministers from various Western countries who are going to meet in order to agree upon future arms deliveries to Ukraine. And with this in mind, I think that a few words about the Ukrainian amphibious landings or attempted amphibious landings near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant are also due. According to reports that are provided to us by the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians have over the last couple of days attempted to land what are essentially special forces, Ukraine's equivalent of the Spetsnaz, at the coast near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, with the goal being to take this nuclear power plant. The first of these attempts took place on September the 1st and saw the Ukrainians land about a platoon's worth of soldiers on the Russian-controlled side of the Dnieper River. This landing took place at 6 a.m. local time, which was mere hours before the scheduled visit of the commission that was sent by the International Atomic Energy Agency to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The forces that the Ukrainians had landed were quickly detected and blocked off in a small village where they were once again slowly ground down by Russian artillery. At 7:30 in the morning, it was reported that two much larger boats carrying about 300 soldiers were also detected and sunk by Russian air power, which then conducted airstrikes on Ukrainian troop formations that were gathered on the other side of the Dnieper River. And later on the same day, it was revealed that the Russian military and Russian intelligence services had discovered the Ukrainians' plans to land forces at the coast near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant sometime before the landing occurred, which is how the Russians were able to intercept this force. It is reported that the Ukrainian armed forces had lost a total of about 300 men in this attempted amphibious landing near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and I would emphasize once more that these are not just conscripts, but rather the Ukrainian special forces. And 2 days later, today on September 3rd, we've heard another report by the Russian Ministry of Defense of a similar attempted amphibious landing, this time involving 42 small motorboats, each of which was carrying around 10 to 15 Marines. Once again, this force was detected from the air by Sukhoi 30 fighter jets and by Ka-52 attack helicopters, and after the destruction of 20 of these motorboats, the remainder were forced to turn around. Therefore, the amphibious landing never took place. We've also heard reports that at least some of the soldiers that were involved in these operations near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant were among the 10,000 that were trained and supplied by the United Kingdom. At any rate, this is what the Russians are saying. Given that the Ukrainians and the collective West are not talking about these two incidents at all, we really don't have much else to go by. So with all of this said, given that the current round of intensive fighting at the Kherson-Nikolaev front line is currently ongoing, I think that we should wait and see how it ends and what it leads to within the next 1 or 2 weeks. I don't want to make any long-term predictions until then. Instead, I'm going to dedicate the remainder of this video to discussing recent developments in the fighting. In the early days of the fighting, it was reported, and we've seen photo and video confirmation of this, that many of the destroyed tanks that were being used by the Ukrainians were T-72 M1 tanks, which were previously supplied by the hundreds to Ukraine by Poland. These tanks, despite having poor armor and low firepower by modern standards, are equipped with thermal cameras, which, as I understand, are much more modern and capable than many of the other ones that are being used by other Ukrainian tanks. But more interesting than this are a few reports which were put out by the Rybar team mere hours before this video was recorded, which stated that German manufactured Leopard 2 tanks were sighted near the front lines in the Kherson-Nikolaev region. It is currently believed that these tanks were supplied to Ukraine by Spain. If this is true, then this is yet another weapons shipment which was not officially announced, and it is currently unknown as to whether these tanks belong to the Leopard 2A4 or the Leopard 2A6 modification. But regardless of which modification is being used, it now appears that Leopard 2 tanks have officially entered the Ukraine war. We've also seen some footage of Russian vehicles, particularly one Russian tank being destroyed by what is claimed to be a TB2 Bayraktar drone. If this is true, then this would be the first confirmed kill that any TB2 has gotten in this war since, if I'm not mistaken, since the month of April. And that would suggest that Ukraine has acquired a new shipment of TB2 Bayraktar drones, which are currently being used on the Kherson-Mykolaiv front. These drones do not necessarily have to be used for attack purposes. They are very effective in reconnaissance missions. They can guide artillery fire very well, and if they are being used for strike purposes, then they are most likely also being used for reconnaissance purposes as well. And another interesting report that I found has talked about the Russian Air Force, or the VKS, being much more active over the Kherson-Mykolaiv front than has been the case previously over other parts of the front line in Ukraine. Reports suggest that these planes have been dropping Fab 500, which are 500 kilogram high explosive bombs, by the dozens. And these are unguided bombs, meaning that to drop these bombs, aircraft have to fly at medium altitude. Now, I think that it's important to note that the use of unguided bombs does not mean that guided munitions are not also being used. But what it does say, specifically the fact that these aircraft are flying over enemy troop formations at medium altitude, is that currently Ukrainian air defenses in this area of the front line appear to be rather weak, given that they appear to be unable to intercept Russian aircraft which are flying at medium altitudes. And what this suggests is that when Ukrainian soldiers move out of their front lines in order to attempt to attack the Russians in the latter's defensive positions, the range of Ukraine's air defenses is simply not enough to cover the areas in which these soldiers operate. And that, of course, makes this offensive much more difficult for the Ukrainian side. So, given all of this, I've already said that I don't want to make any long-term predictions before we get more updates in the following days and weeks, but I think that it is safe to say that this is not the grand offensive that is going to seize the city of Kherson, to capture it right from under the Russians' noses. Right now, the question stands, will the Ukrainians be able to push the Russians from their current positions at all, even by a few dozen or perhaps just a few kilometers, or will this offensive fail and fall completely flat on its face? And I think that we will simply have to wait and see which one is going to be true. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to this channel, and also please be sure to check out my other channels, specifically on Telegram, where I post regular small updates and where we have discussions on matters that are not always covered on my main YouTube channel. With that said, I thank you for watching this video and I wish you a wonderful day.